Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're embarking on a truly fascinating deep dive. We're getting into Oscar Munoz's book, The Path of Beauty, specifically Chapter 2, Duality and Reality. And it kicks off right away with some pretty big questions, doesn't it? Like, is our modern wisdom really superior to what the ancients knew? Do we actually understand ourselves and the world more profoundly now? And, is all this focus on rational thinking really the ultimate path to wisdom?
Yeah, exactly. And our mission here really is to maybe shake up your intuitive grasp of logic a bit. We want to explore different ways reality might operate and ultimately question what it even means to be human and maybe ask if we can ever truly, discover something completely new.
Okay, so the book introduces this idea of dual thinking right at the start. Says it's the foundation of modern rationality. What exactly is that, and why is it considered so, foundational?
Right. So dual thinking, as the source puts it, is fundamentally limited. It's limited by something called the principle of contradiction in logic. Basically, this rule says that within a specific system, a statement about something can't be true and false at the exact same time. So, for example, I can't be Gabriel's father and not Gabriel's father simultaneously. That's just logic, right?
Yeah.
Or I can't, in this very instant, be speaking with you and not speaking with you. And this principle, it formally expresses that two-sided way we perceive objects in space and time. It sort of projects everything onto a two-dimensional system, if that makes sense.
But hold on, doesn't reality itself feel dual? I mean, we navigate everything with opposites, yeah. Light, dark, up, down, good, bad. How could we even function, really, without thinking in those kinds of duality?
That's a really great point. And yes, that's absolutely how our everyday experience feels structured. It is structured that way. But the argument here is that reality isn't actually confined to just these two-dimensional systems. Not entirely. In fact, when you look at quantum reality, there are objects that aren't just difficult to pin down in a simple true-false way. They're not even really definable or determinable as distinct objects in the first place.
Not definable? Like what?
We'll take an electron. In the quantum world, electrons are apparently utterly indistinguishable from one another, completely.
Mm-hmm.
So our usual way of thinking, sequentially, based on identifying one thing as separate from another, it just doesn't work there. These particles, they're neither identical to themselves nor different from others in the way we normally understand it. And what's really mind-bending is that a single object, whatever that even means at this level, can apparently exist in two distinct locations at once. The electron is the famous example of this.
Wow. Okay. Indistinguishable. Two places at once. That does sort of break our everyday understanding of what an object even is. So what does that imply for how we're taught to think, how our logic is structured?
Precisely. It really challenges those fundamental assumptions we have.
Yeah.
And if you connect this to the bigger picture, the source suggests that these burgeoning new theories in science, they're explaining the universe, human identity, all of that. But at their core, they're essentially just new configurations, maybe exquisite variations on this timeless theme of these soul life.
Soul life. Can you elaborate on that term a bit?
Sure. It refers to sort of the underlying timeless consciousness or fabric of existence itself, the deep current beneath the surface phenomena. So these scientific theories, they offer fresh angles, yes, but the argument is they kind of need a higher wisdom to make full sense within that larger human experience. And in that crucial way, they don't, and maybe couldn't, actually give us a fundamentally new narrative of what it means to be human. Because if they were expressing something totally unprecedented, completely alien to our core experience, well, they'd be unintelligible, wouldn't they? Like hearing a language you've never encountered before, you wouldn't grasp it. Think about quantum physics. From a purely dualistic everyday logic perspective, it's baffling, but it starts to reveal its own intricate logic when you look from a non-dual vantage point. So learning science, in this view, is basically like learning a new dual language. You learn to create these formalized mental representations. But for these representations to have any real meaning, they ultimately have to connect back, to refer back to the general shared experience of life itself.
That's a fascinating way to put it, especially connecting modern science back to, maybe older or different ways of knowing. Actually, allow me to throw in a kind of surprising historical parallel here. During the European Middle Ages, you had these incredibly learned scholars engaging in really fervent debates about the precise sexual gender of angels.
Right. And that's a great example because today, when theoretical physics speculates on, say, the multiverse, this vast concept, it arguably displays a similar kind of, let's call it, semantic exhaustion, a limit in its conceptual framework. It inadvertently ends up reclaiming these very ancient themes like the kalpas, these huge cosmic cycles of creation and dissolution,
Right.
or the pralayas, which are epochs of cosmic non-manifestation, kind of like the universe taking a breath, and also the subtle worlds that Gnostic science, which is an ancient tradition of spiritual knowledge, has apparently studied and intimately experienced from completely different paradigm. The failing, according to the source, happens when modern frameworks don't manage to project true meaning onto that deeper soul of life, when they don't connect back to that fundamental human experience.
That really raises a provocative question then. If there's nothing truly new under the sun
Yeah.
in that sense, then what is it that we're constantly repeating through our actions, through our speech, day in and day out?
Well, from a purely physiological, biological perspective, we're endlessly repeating a handful of basic survival routines. Our instincts, right? Or what we often term basic emotions: fight, flight, feed, reproduce, those deep patterns. We act fundamentally from what's already known. We use protocols, ways of behaving that have demonstrably kept us alive, maintained our organic homeostasis, things that have shown their evolutionary validity, their deep alignment with what the source calls, or a bit of, think of it as cosmic order, the universal law of harmony. And thinking in its essence is always presented here as a reaction. It's a reflection or a repetition of something that was already in motion. And this repetition goes deep. Our verbal discourse, our speech, at its very core, primarily expresses the past. We might feel like we're expressing our unique individual selves, this is my thought. But the argument is, it's often the entire human species finding its voice through us, echoing down the generations, our conscious memory. It's just an infinitesimal fraction of this immense, long memory of life itself. And that's why the enduring fascination of the myths we inherit is so important. They clearly mark out the true limits of our everyday dualistic thinking. And they also illuminate how genuinely new narratives of identity, new ways of understanding ourselves have actually come into being throughout history.
Okay, so what then do these myths, these narratives of identity that we live by, what do they truly represent? Are they like faithful pictures of reality itself?
Well, no, not exactly. Our verbal communications, our stories, our myths, they're more like incomplete representations, maps. Really. They're maps of the incredibly intricate fabric of the human soul. All the desires, feelings, thoughts woven into our actual lived experience. And crucially, no scientific text, no logical argument, no matter how precise it seems. None of it is a truly faithful image of that profound experience, or of the world where it seems to happen. We absolutely must never confuse the model with what's being modeled, right? Like confusing a photograph of a dolphin with the actual living, swimming dolphin, or mistaking a theory about the universe for the universe itself.
That's a vital distinction. The map isn't the territory.
Exactly. And just think about our basic perception. Our eyes, for instance, discern only a minuscule fraction, like 0.0035% of the entire electromagnetic spectrum. So our primary sense organ gives us incredibly limited data about physical reality right from the start. So our theories, our myths, they're maps, as you said. Maps that we continuously re-elaborate, redraw, generation after generation. But they're always drawn upon the same fundamental territories of vital experience. Our physical lives, our psychological lives, our spiritual lives. Do they get more precise? Yes, absolutely. But often only in those specific aspects of the universe where precision is even applicable. That is, usually only within those conceptual systems where we can distinctly identify finite quantities, whole numbers, finite repeatable processes, which the source characterizes as a kind of machine-like thinking, one that tends to fail to account for things like entropy, the inherent tendency towards disorder and change. Now, human thought, yes, it's founded on identity and difference, on that principle of contradiction we talked about, just like a machine's logic might be. But importantly, it's not confined solely to those dualistic machine-like conditionings. At least it doesn't have to be. It's inherently open to the boundless flow of life itself. It demands continuous processes for forming new identities, new ways of understanding. And it has this creative dimension, this ability for imaginative synthesis, for putting things together in novel ways. Often the solution to really profound problems in thinking isn't found within the system, but by expanding the perspective on the problem, extending the boundaries way beyond the system itself. And this, the source argues, is a capacity that the thought of a machine simply cannot achieve on its own. Look at those ancient mathematical problems that have remained unsolved for centuries, even with all our computing power.
Okay, that distinction between human and machine thought is interesting. It makes me wonder about more abstract concepts then. Like, is our understanding today of concepts like freedom or justice somehow more precise, more complete than what humanity possessed in the past?
Well, see, framing the question like that, more precise, more complete, it kind of carries no intrinsic meaning in this context.
Yeah.
Concepts like freedom and justice possess a psychological complexity that just defies quantification. You can't easily measure them. Not all concepts are quantifiable, and not all complexity is merely numerical. How we understand freedom is entirely dependent on the system of values we choose to place it within. Think about freedom defined within a slave society versus freedom defined within an egalitarian society. The concept itself shifts dramatically, doesn't it? Both intellectually and emotionally.
Right. The context changes everything. So if I'm trying to understand freedom non-dually, as you mentioned earlier, can I do that without constantly referring back to its opposite, like bondage or limitation?
Okay, good question. If you're just aiming for a mental image of freedom, then yes, you probably need its opposite, bondage or restriction, to define it against. That's how dualistic language often works. Freedom is not being bound. But if you want to conceive of it differently, maybe as an initial movement, something self-generating. An autopoietic motor, as the text says, a self-moving force. Well, that evokes ideas like Aristotle's unmoved mover, or maybe a first cause, or a God. And that requires what Toast calls a non-dual speech, a different way of thinking and speaking about it, that kind of positive mental form. It doesn't bear much resemblance to our usual actions or our standard dualistic thinking. But, and this is key, if what you're really seeking is a process of feeling, a state where the essence of freedom reveals itself to you as a direct sentiment and experience, then the concept freedom itself becomes kind of irrelevant if it's not intimately united with the genuine feeling, I am free. And that feeling, that state of being, it requires no description. It's just there. It's so intrinsically woven into the fundamental desire to live, into the very pulse of the soul, you might say. From the vantage point of the will, from that deep drive, to be free is just the pure spontaneity of the desire to be.
That's a really powerful distinction. The concept versus the lived, felt experience. So what does all this mean for us? For the thinking subject, the I that's having these thoughts and feelings.
Well, the unknown, it's far, far closer to you than any of your thoughts about it. The thinking subject itself, the you that is thinking right now, that's the great mystery for thinking itself. Because any objective image that thinking tries to construct of that subject, it inevitably destroys its true nature. It turns it into just another object, another concept. But the subject, by its very definition here, is a non-object. It's that which thinks and comprehends. It's the vantage point before which the object appears. We cannot think a non-object in the way we think about chairs or trees, nor can we truly know it as an object of knowledge. We can only be it, as occurs, in this very instant in which we think and comprehend, feel, and desire. You're being that subject right now. So it's not really a matter of knowing some fundamental principle from which all knowledge derives, but rather it's about knowing the knower of that principle. And how do we know the knower? We know it by being subject, by being the being itself. And for this, crucially, nothing needs to be done. There's no process, no method, no how-to guide. You're already doing it, or rather being it. And indeed, the Source talks about a kind of thinking, feeling as being. This suggests a mental dimension that isn't just confined to rational, logical speech, but one which profoundly includes the emotional and the volitional dimensions, the feeling and willing aspects of the soul. This non-dual thinking is described as musical in the most expansive sense. It's temporal, fluid, founded on harmony, polyphony, on mimesis like mirroring or embodying in presence. It's the kind of thinking that conventional rationality often just labels as inspired or intuitive. Ultimately, the universe and consciousness aren't just concepts for our finite human minds to fully box in and grasp. Consciousness is the very condition of possibility for having any intuitions about them in the first place, and the appearance of the universe itself. That's seen as the grand action of consciousness force, the play of being, a kind of cosmic game of self-limitation, where the fundamental I am expresses itself through the ceaseless actions of consciousness.
I have to admit, listening to all this, I'm getting this unsettling sensation, almost like I'm treading the very same path again. I find myself formulating the same kinds of questions, experiencing these familiar feelings of maybe limitation or confusion. It seems like my individual will, my desire to live a full life, keeps crashing against this iron wheel of samsara, the book mentions, this world of appearances, which includes both what we call the universe and our human existence right smack in the middle of it. It feels cyclical.
Please, don't feel disheartened about asking the same questions. It's absolutely an inevitable part of the journey. It continues until you truly begin to understand the very origin of questioning itself. Where do these questions come from? Think about it. If all our accumulated knowledge, our science, our philosophy, even our fiery ignorance, if it were all somehow wiped out in some mysterious species-wide amnesia, we would inevitably start asking the exact same fundamental questions that our most distant ancestors once posed about who we are, why we're here, what the world is. We probably use the same basic methods, fall into the same errors of comprehension, endure the same frustrations, and yes, celebrate the same joys of discovery. And actually, this is precisely what we do generation after generation, isn't it? We re-ask the big questions. But there often comes a moment in life, maybe for individuals, maybe for cultures, when we start to yearn for something more, something we can't quite name, something that seems to reside beyond this dualistic thought, beyond the yes-no, true-false framework, something that our basic survival needs just can't satiate anymore. It's a moment when we can grow weary, truly weary, of the blind, mechanical repetition of samsara, that cycle of everyday life, often lived unconsciously. And we begin to seek spontaneity, genuine freedom, pure, unconditioned air, as the Source puts it. We often transform experience into a symbol, a concept, purely to control it, to repeat it right, but often without ever truly comprehending the broader reality that the symbol is ceaselessly pointing towards. And in doing this, we form these simulacra of identities. The book calls them bronzed masks. Masks that we kind of forcefully impose upon our inner psychic life and upon our experience. And these masks, they tend to ossify the soul, to make it rigid, subjecting it to the narrow confines of dualistic living. So the questions formulated by any one of our masks, the mask of the professional, the parent, the artist, they only hold meaning in relation to that specific mask. But they utterly fail to satisfy the deeper movements, the deeper questions arising from our soul. And it's through this very act of repetition, paradoxically, that life generates the mirage, the appearance of identity in the first place. And with this appearance of stable identity, it subtly hides the inherent fragility of its own material form. This impossible repetition, this constant valiant attempt to fix a movement, a flow, that's far vaster than anything that takes solid form in the physis, the material world. It expresses itself instead in an infinitude of differences, of variations. And if life, or if we awaken to this ongoing action, we might discover that these very differences, these variations, they actually express life's changing identity far better than the strict, mineral, rigid repetition that might have started as its principle way back, like the self-replicating molecule. Change shows identity better than sameness.
That's a fascinating perspective on identity and repetition. So then what is the role I play as a person, as an individual, in this grand vital representation, this cosmic
Play. So the mask that we call our person, our individual self, it has to essentially repeat its constitutive narrative of identity every single day. How does it do this? By continually retelling ancient, inherited stories, cultural narratives, family narratives, personal narratives, or by breathing new life into them, giving them novel variational forms within an updated contemporary language. But the key point is, an identity narrative like this neither corresponds nor could it correspond perfectly to the action of just one isolated person. It's always partly collective. Yet this collective individual identity story is fundamentally necessary for the functioning of the individual, for making sense of daily life.
So thinking about that daily renewal, is our identity then kind of like the phoenix, continually being reborn from its own ashes day after day?
Precisely. That's a perfect metaphor. Our identity, in a really profound sense, must be born and perish daily. Our soul, in its ceaseless stream of thinking, feeling, and willing, has to reaffirm its marks of identity throughout our waking hours, only to lose them again, dissolve them perhaps when it falls into slumber, into the unconscious. And the same applies to the human groups we belong to, the ones from which we derive these often fragile masks we wear. Those groups also need periodic reconstructions of their own identity, enacted through their daily myths, their rituals, their shared stories. So if you, the listener, feel consumed sometimes by the sheer mechanicidad, the mechanical nature of samsara, by unconscious and maybe empty feeling everyday life, by the common perspective expressed in those pervasive linguistic cliches we all use. This happens, the Source suggests, because you have identified yourself too strongly with one particular narrative of identity, one specific mask, and you're exhausted by the limitations of the thinking inherent in that mask, which you have mistakenly taken as your own inherent limitations. But you are not any of the masks you experience, nor are you their sole artificer, their sole creator. Those masks are transpersonal. They have been created, shaped, passed down by the general ceaseless processes of the soul life itself.
Wow, okay. That's a lot to take in. We've really journeyed deep into this chapter of the path of beauty. We've unpacked the limitations of our usual dualistic thought, explored how reality might be profoundly non-dual at its core, and landed on this challenging idea of our identities as these shifting masks, not entirely our own within this vast, repeating, yet endlessly creative soul life.
Exactly. And it really boils down to this idea that True wisdom, true knowledge isn't just about concepts and theories. It fundamentally lies in the direct experience of, well, being the knower, being that subject we talked about.
Right. So here's a final thought for you to mull over. What does it actually mean for your perception of daily life, for your sense of who you are, when you start to recognize that the limitations you feel, the box you feel trapped in sometimes, might not actually be your limitations at all? What if they're the limitations of a mask, a transpersonal pattern, continually being recreated by the vast, impersonal, ceaseless processes of life itself? How does that change things for you?